Welcome back, everybody. It's the Working Brother. We've got a surprise guest for you this time. It's Xoaquin Flores from the New Resistance. How you doing,
Hey, what's up?
Xoaquin?
I'm good. I'm
Welcome
good.
to the show.
How's it going? Having a
Pretty
little
good,
coffee
pretty
here.
good.
So we got like, yeah, dude. I've been looking at the Putin thing.
We've got that Putin speech going on live in the background. What have you, what were you expecting versus what was actually said?
No, he's saying we're gonna do this as long as it takes. He said, he said something weird in there. If you caught it, like every 6 months in the special military operation moving forward, the soldiers got to take 14 days off. So, you know.
Yeah. He was
And then
saying
the next
something
date that he
about
uses,
seeing their families.
and then the next date that he uses immediately after that, although perhaps in reference to only something directly related,
Yeah.
is 2025.
I didn't catch the 2045 reference.
2025.
Oh, 2025? So that's
Mm-hmm.
when he's expecting it to be over?
Well, no, I'm just
You're
saying
hinting
the
at?
way when you read it. Well, when you read it, if you were to read the transcript or whether you to listen to what he was saying, it's every 6 months. Moving forward, every 6 months the guys are going to have 14 days off.
Mm-hmm.
And then he mentioned something about development stabilization 2025, and you're like, okay.
Interesting. I thought it
So he
was
didn't say. So he didn't say we're. So he didn't. So he did not say we're taking the special military operation until the year 2025. But you do. You read the.
you can fill in the blanks, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So there was no declaration of war, at least not so far. And there
We're
was
still expecting
no unitary state with China, which is what some people were predicting.
a unitary state with China.
Yeah, that's one of the what's it called? Theories that I heard that they were going to increase their cooperation and become one state. That was funny. But yeah,
What they said
other
is
than
that
that,
you know what, we have projects that are going to be capital intensive, but actually we don't owe any foreigner any money, and
hmm
so we'll be we don't need access to investment capital to do what we're doing, and then and also we have the resources, like the natural resources and the technical capacity to do it, connect their currency connected to natural resources. What else?
so like basically the new reserve currency that they're setting up.
Like, yeah, just I don't know if it's like a parallel, but not really, because it's integrated, because countries may have options unless, if this kind of, really you're talking about BRICS. So people in one way talking about, Russia, China, I mean,
hmm
I know what they're saying. Obviously, Russia's not going to suffer the consequences of a sanctions the way that it would have even 40 or 30 years ago, because of the development of like capital flows and how capital has flowed to major developed centers. See, if you follow following from his speech a year ago, he was talking
hmm
about the colonial model. He was talking about how the classical colonial powers or the historical colonial powers had an advantage in terms of capital concentration. So a lot of the history of like the 19th and 20th century was really just kind of built up off of that advantage. So I guess he gave it all together with a 400 or 500 year period, right, historically. And now he's saying that the what used to be called the third world or the developing world has actually, those economies have diversified and become more complex and more developed, such that with all of that, I guess, billion people, which comprise, the kind of Europe and the US and Canada and all that, right? Roughly maybe 900 million or what have you. Yeah. So he's saying that this is just not enough of a market share for their boycott to be meaningful with regard to the, economic framework of the other, 7/8 of the planet. You see what I mean?
It's like the kid who's screaming with their mouth shut, saying, "No, I don't want to talk to you," when in reality, nobody wants to talk to them. That's what Europe has become, basically.
Yeah, they're gonna pick up their toys and go home.
Yeah, yeah. And nobody wants to play with them in the first place, is what it's turning out to be.
Well, it's a high price, and they have problems with their brands and their obsession with the premium that they think that their brand comes with. But a lot of times their product is not as durable or as useful as they claim. So I think when you look at the ways that, let's say, just in basic commodity function, like for microchips, for smartphones, and for home computers and things that even businesses rely on scale, you don't really have this problem today that, let's say, countries would have had 30 or 40 years ago, right? Had those types of blockades been. Why? Because you have, let's say, like Taiwan as a leader, right? But Taiwan-China relations were very different. Isn't that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
30, 40 years ago, right? They were basically at war. And today, they're more or less integrated. I mean, yes, Soros was able to propel a new government into power that has kind of a new ideology, like the New Democratic Party, basically. I think they're called the Greens. And not to be confused with the environmentalists, but they have them too. And in Taiwan. And the growth of this artificial construct called Taiwanese nationalism.
Yeah.
You see, the one China policy was also the real policy of Taiwan. That's what the whole contest was about. No one believed that Taiwan is not part of China.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that the government of China in exile in Taiwan were just claiming it as their base of occupation, pending enough support from the international community to overthrow the Chinese communist rogue regime, you see.
So what do you think? Do you think China is supplying weapons to Russia? Or is that just propaganda from the West?
It's propaganda from the West, but it's shorthand for the fact that China and Russia are actually doing business today, continue to do with most of the, we talk about most of the population of the planet. Yeah. So the sanctions against Russia are super limited to a handful of European countries, maybe a handful of other Latin American countries, but in a much smaller scale, but really just for the propaganda purpose of like kind of echoing the needs of whatever the French or Spanish banks involved in the Latin American exploits, you see.
And what do you think about the fact that like there has been no official reaction, let's say, or retaliation about the Nord Stream revelations that have come out? Like, I mean, it was obvious from day one what happened, but like now that it's like public secret out in the open, and that we've got Chinese balloons all over the sky, what do you think? Why do you think that Russia has been so reluctant to
It's a good question, but I don't think they've been reluctant. It's just that, like you said, it was obvious from the start. It was obvious from the start. So just look at how there's no speaking from the Russian perspective. That just think about the pipelines that exist now.
Mm-hmm.
Without Nord Stream, there's a couple others, but the rest go through Ukraine to the Hungarian border. Well, yeah. What do you mean respond? Like complain about it? Like cry on TV or get mad or something? Or continue the fucking special military operation to secure the energy pipelines which exist?
The special military operation definitely does secure one of the, like, let's say, avenues of energy supply to Europe, but I'm thinking more like actual kinetic, retaliation, or at least legal repercussions of some sort on like an international scale. Wouldn't you
Sure. I
think
mean,
that maybe?
Germany, yeah. I mean, Germany is also an aggrieved party. So
Yeah,
that's,
definitely.
so it's, if Germany doesn't really, the de facto problem is that if Germany doesn't officially articulate that this is a problem for them,
Hmm.
then it can just be seen sort of like in the abstract way, like fuck laws, but in the abstract way is like, one of the two parties unilaterally canceled, which they probably have the right to do in some language of Nord Stream anyhow, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the problem, I think, in terms of the public's mind's eye. It really, Germany needs to raise the stink about it, and that presupposes a whole bunch of other problems with the situation of sovereignty in Germany.
All right, shifting gears a little bit, let's get into some things that you're, let's say, more specialized in. You studied political science, is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Actually,
So,
Russia, international relations, security. So we are talking about the area now. We're talking about energy security in Russia. That is area that I'm most like read in terms of the university academic. But
all right.
other areas like in political philosophy are just when you study international relations, as part of a political science program, you also, I mean, I don't know how it works in Europe, Western Europe, or Eastern Europe, right? But United States,
Hmm.
you have to do all like the 1, 2, 300 level courses in political philosophy. Can people just get by and whatever? Yeah, but I mean, people who are genuinely interested in knowledge and actually read the books that are on the syllabus that the professor, gives, even at we're talking about like maybe the 2 or 300 level, you're going to be fairly well read in a lot of political philosophy as well, underlying the political sciences. So yeah,
All
it's
right.
all about
And
the reading.
what's your take on the various narratives that are being propagated by people all over the blogosphere, let's put it that way, that things are about to change, the world is changing, the world order, the political system. You talk about it often on your live streams. Why don't you let people know where
Yeah,
they can find
yeah,
you?
there's a
Because
yeah, there's a, I'm doing a live stream on Telegram, and it's the channel is at New Resistance, and at New Resistance on Telegram. That's how you find it. And what were you saying? The question was what? Like one of the
what
things
what
that
is
I
the
talked about.
yeah, like the narrative that's being let's say propagated among
Oh,
many
about the
many
world is
people.
changing and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
like the world is changing. I mean, look, it's Russia's not changing it per se. It's just these are just all like no one should get the message from me that like Russia is doing something messianic or Russia is leading the way or something like that. These are all just the
Mhm.
convulsions of a whole world of development. And one of the outspurts or something is these things happening in Russia. You see what I mean? It's what's happening in Russia is incidental to like all the global development, and it's a consequence of the contradictions in the global system that existed, especially the world that the Western forces, they're in their hegemonic approach, um, which was totalizing, and sometimes people talk about full spectrum domination and things like this. They were fixated on breaking up or breaking down Russia into kind of more integratable, digestible units, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
now the changes that are
What
happening, though, but their desire to do that and their continued failed desire to do that is just kind of like an echo from the past of this ongoing kind of Cold War system that through sort of a tragedy of human interactions, like the behemoth of this kind of Russia oriented military industrial complex. You see, there's kind of like these organizations take on a life of their own,
Mhm.
because you build up all these organizations, say during like the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and they're all kind of Cold War and anti-Russia. Well, now that's where all your expertise is. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like all your expertise is in that. So in other words, like to the hammer, all problems are nails. And to the Soviet experts that dominated the American cultural IR scene in the 70s and 60s, right? All problems are Russian. So
Or
so
communist. Yeah.
or whatever, but it's, the problem is the Russians, geopolitically,
Mhm.
right? Um, Communists you can work with. The problem is Russia as a geopolitical, the size of it, that it's all organized in a single way, in a sovereign way. So that has been the primary issue, So, but the fact that they haven't actually created a new global goal other than the destruction of Russia. They haven't developed a way of actually integrating human ingenuity into the next generation of, let's say, technical advances, whether it's
Mhm.
3D printing, et cetera, right? Internet of Things or whatever. Um, and the way that they've tried to kind of, I'm saying the Western think tanks, et cetera, and the World Economic Forum and so forth, have tried to co-opt all these ideas, which contain tremendous potential, or the trends that they're talking about, not their ideas about them, but the trends which those things represent that they're talking about, have tremendous potential to, continue to transform things in the direction that improves people's lives in some way, right? But with the World Economic Forum and hijacking these things and talking about them the way they do, um, you would think they were all bad things, and their agenda for it is all bad things. So, but it's not because they're actually going to do all these wonderful things that they talk about, but they're only going to do the coercive things that are required to guarantee that those things could work under their control. So
Got it.
the real technologies are moving against their kind of way of doing things. I'm not talking about some totally horizontal anarchist society or something on the horizon. I'm saying that hierarchies have to regenerate, and they become inorganic after they become ossified over time. And then, but there's always people who have different talents and do different things or different motivations. And so you're going to have, and a particular person's interest, and as they should be free to choose them, um, may vary in its importance to what's happening more broadly in development of man. So some fields might be more scarce or harder to master or more respected than others and so forth. So we're not talking about some kind of flattening of all human relations or something like that, but realistically, in the coming century to 2 centuries, you'd be looking at man being able to make use of machines and AI, um, but not have other men use the illusion of artificial intelligence um, being as much more broad in power and scope than it actually ever probably could ever be, as a justification to establish a kind of metrics about who should get things or who shouldn't, based upon the perspective of this ossified, inorganic hierarchy, if that makes sense, who are kind of holding on to the way things work, 30 and 50 years ago. You see what I
Mhm.
mean?
Mhm.
So that's
Yep.
really and so the events in Russia are only just a consequence of these things, and but it's a consequence of a country which is not inconsequential. You see,
Yeah.
it's the consequences on a country which has tremendous whatever percentage, but it's in the double digits of all the world's natural resources.
Mhm.
So striking, really.
Interesting. Thank you for your insight. One of the things that I really respect about you is your ability to like cover many different topics and tie them all together, kind of like a syncretic approach to stuff. One of the things that I recently heard you mention on one of your streams was the gargoyle effect. Do you want to clue people into what the gargoyle effect is and
Sure.
how
Yeah.
it applies
Yeah.
to
Bitcoin.
things that are going on?
Absolutely. Why do blowfish blow up? You know what I mean? Uh, why do bears stand up on their hind legs, or why do they tell little kids, if you see a bear, to put your backpack on top of your head or put your book standing up on top of your head, right?
Yeah, to
Because
appear bigger, to scare them. Yeah.
because being able to avoid a conflict in a way that benefits you is better than having to engage in a conflict,
Mhm.
right? Now, there's certain implicit things in there which are fascinating once you understand the gargoyle effect, because it also inherently infers, or implies rather, that without such methods, the stability of their inorganic hierarchy would be much more evident, or the stability would be much less stable, in fact. So there's much to do with this consciousness, has to do a lot with it, right? So the gargoyle effect is really a psychological operation on the public, and it means to kind of make them seem much more organized and powerful than they really are. That doesn't mean that the CIA can't assassinate you, or blow up your car or something like that. But what we're talking about, of course, is the consequence on matters of world shaping scale, right?
Mhm.
And so by one of those things is, we know for a long time, well, it's popular on the internet to talk about the, Hasbara, or like the original Israeli troll army back, the first kind of, you can say the first state whose legitimacy was maybe shaken by the rise of Internet 2.0 was when, because of like Palestinians using their Nokias and stuff to take video of things happening with the Israeli military, right? And many people saw those and felt that,
Yeah.
those were maybe in a category maybe called war crimes. Other people saw those and felt that, or determined, maybe legal scholars have spoken to it and said, hey, there's been no trial per se, but I think on the face of it, that looks like war crimes or crimes against humanity, right? So, it seemed therefore prudent for the Israeli state to then invest in a project to maybe help manage its online presence, or its online perception, to the world outside of Israel, to help improve how people might understand Israel's perspective with regard to the occupation, right? So, in the words of Ariel Sharon, Israeli Prime Minister, this occupation, which is an occupation that, as in the words of Ariel Sharon, is unstable, it's untenable, right? So, but this was the first country that we can document that used what's called a troll army, and for reasons which I think are very rational to their own national security, right, requirements when you consider them, right? And therefore, to see them then kind of that model maybe exported, right, or taught about abroad, and other countries built troll armies too. The Americans, the Russians, everyone has a troll army now, as they call it. So I think that when you look at the question of how in a conflict like today, or how the system is trying to manage perception and inflate its power, like its perception of power, they're using troll armies. But there's also, beyond bots and trolls, there are probably even, and it would be surprising if there weren't. I'm making no accusations of any individuals. I'm saying that dogmatically, like programmatically, from the intelligence perspective in the U.S., there almost must assuredly be also people considered intellectuals, or bloggers, or writers, or YouTubers, on various levels, whether considered academic or more popular, who are promoting, this very black pill idea that that the elites, that everything in all of history is an elite master plan. And when you speak about them, then it's almost like they've lived for thousands of years, and you're conferring really like, extra human powers upon people who lack the self-reflectivity to even question, what they're doing right now, in a spiritual sense or in a historical sense. So the idea that they're somehow able to coordinate, or that it would rely on that explanation for world events is not supportable either by the evidence, nor is it meet the requirement of elegance, right? So it's irrational. And rather than that, it's more likely that there are bloggers and troll armies and even public thinkers who point to how powerful the deepness of the conspiracy that they actually control the whole world already and things like this, and that there's no point in fighting it. That all of the worst dystopic and technocratic, nightmaric kind of visions of a future that you wouldn't want to live in. Are you with me? That
Yeah.
these are inevitable. You see what I mean? And this is kind of like programming through fear and through acting like you're against it. It's like programming the public to accept it. Some of these people, it's very interesting, as who are black pill, who are obviously troll army members. In their
Just to clue in some of the viewers who may not be familiar with the lingo, you might want to like explain exactly what black pill means, and then
people
what a
probably
troll
know, but a
army is.
black pill is just a total nihilist approach to everything. It's whether or not it's supported. What it is like the worst possible thing that I can imagine is probably what's happening.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like
And
they see the worst in every situation, basically.
it's even imagining worse than the evidence would even allow to suggest. And then, but that's different from red pill, which is understanding how things really work, separate from how the system or society working against your interests is trying to teach it. You see what I mean? So red and black pill, very different things. And so the appeal to the black pill is just that it's not the blue pill. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Right. So
you were getting into troll armies who are definitely black pill.
Yeah, definitely a concerted effort, because you will notice the tone, or you first need to be a person who's not emotionally lost at sea, or that your spidey senses have been confused, or you've been told that your intuition isn't good, or maybe because you have bad intuition because you haven't worked through this trauma, and maybe you have bad intuition. But once you're clear of those issues, and then you can rely on your intuition, you can read things, you actually can just then connect to how something appears to be trying to make you feel. See, once you are in control of your responses, then you can assess what's happening separate from your response, and then you can be like, this person is trying to make me feel a certain way. You follow? This works right? That works in your interpersonal life too, right? That's how you can decide, hey, no one can offend me, right? Unless I allow them to, right?
Yep, basically.
That's an important thing in Chicano, like Mexican American culture, right? Is that no one can offend you unless you allow them to. So,
all right, didn't know that.
Yes. And so with these troll armies, you'll see that they'll even, like, in their bios and stuff, either on Twitter or on Telegram, they'll say like information something operations or public relations, or they'll use some kind of like digitech kind of references and stuff like this to, security analysis or something, blah blah blah, or security in public messaging or whatever the fuck. You're like, oh, okay, so this is actually a troll who's publicly identifying as a troll. It's amazing. Sometimes they'll use like an eye as like their avatar, or some kind of frightening or imposing
visual,
or frightening visual, and you're supposed to feel like this is the threat. In other words, like they're getting by acting like, oh, I'm here to tell you about bad news. But another thing in the Chicano communities we know as well is like the person coming at you with the threat, with the warning, is often just the fucking coward way to deliver the threat. You see what I mean?
You've educated me personally on what Chicano actually means, but for a non-American or non-Hispanic American audience, do you want to like elaborate exactly what Chicano is?
Sure,
Because
sure.
there,
It's basically the Mexicans left behind in America from after the Mexican-American War, mixed in
mhm.
with maybe the immigrants under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which allowed Mexican migrants into the U.S., which should be still in effect actually, within the historical patterns of the migratory farming and stuff like that, which goes from south of the Rio Grande north into California Valley through Texas, Arizona, back south into the Juarez, south Chihuahua, and etc. So there's a whole ecosystem and a human travel, right? And the semi-nomadic
Yeah.
Native Americans, actually, whom we call Mexicans, because that's also part of it, right? So
Mhm.
it's basically like the Spanish-speaking Native Americans who were once part of Mexico, Empire of Mexico, Republic, whatever, who became part of the United States, and then others who came pretty much through until about the 1960s or 70s. And then afterwards, the Chicano culture is not really that. It's the migrants who come from the waves in the 80s, and then the different groups, like talking about Salvadorans and so forth, like during Nicaraguans from the war, like the Reagan wars, the Civil War in El Salvador, and right, those migrants and refugees and stuff, totally different. And the Mexicans that later coming from like the south of Mexico is a different, they're like almost from a different country. But the idea is kind of like northern Mexico and the American Southwest is actually kind of a thing. Does that make sense? So,
Yeah, yeah.
uh, and whereas kind of like the human groups of Mexico, like around Mexico City, is like already too far south. Like indigenous to that area is
Mhm.
already kind of too far south. So in that sense, are related to Comanche Indians, or related to all the Uto Aztecan speaking, tribes of the American Southwest, right? Which is like based similar to the Aztec Nahuatl language. But so a lot of that also has to do with like consciousness and knowing about the history of the American Southwest. And it was kind of a movement that the idea of Chicano kind of rose around the same time as the idea of like Black Power in the 1960s in America as well. But the culture that it's describing is a little bit kind of like this type of way of being an American in Los Angeles, let's say, that was really crystallized in the period between like the 1920s and the 1960s, culturally speaking. So a lot of
Mhm.
that involves Americanism. So it's not Mexican. It's a lot of the American things, American things from that time period as well, from American pop culture as understood through the Mexican American lens. See, all that is part of the Chicano thing. Old
Gotcha.
American art, like lowriders and all this stuff. So all that is like in there.
All
And
right,
it's
moving
totally
back,
distinct from Mexico. Yeah, totally distinct from
move,
Mexico.
moving back a little bit towards your expertise in political science. You know, I've been accused of being unsensitive, calling people liberals left and right when they have purple hair and whatnot. What is, as a political scientist, what is your take on what liberal means as opposed to what it used to mean? You know, what is a
Yeah,
classic liberal versus what is a liberal these days, and why are we
right,
fighting against the
sure.
liberal order of the West?
Yeah, um, liberal as a word really fell out of use for a period of time in the 20th century, and it seems to be kind of come back around the Kennedy period, and Kennedy speaking favorably about liberal, right? And uh, it was really kind of this thinking that was very different from maybe liberal in the sense that we mean in the 19th and 18th century, and even those two are a little
Mm-hmm.
different. So it is because the world keeps changing. It's a word whose meaning today can be at odds in some ways with its historical, you know, precedents and references. So it makes it difficult to use in an accurate way because there's really no single agreement on what the word does mean. But we can kind of look at things in terms of what's illiberal, and then you'd have to kind of map out almost through semiotics or through a process political science if things actually wind up being in the direction of the things that liberalism professes, which should be, it's this idea at its core, in the sense of a paradigm of liberalism. It is used to describe the reorganization, let's say, of Europe starting around the close of the 19th century, 18th century, during what they call the first industrial revolution now, maybe signified by the American Revolution, which is a liberal revolution, or the French Revolution, which is a liberal revolution with a somewhat different class character, which led to, and a different geography, different country with different resources and different mentality led to different outcomes. But there's very strong liberal strains in the original French Revolution that are all liberal, and then the Anglo-American development. But continental liberalism and Anglo-American and continental philosophy and Anglo philosophy are different, and Anglo liberalism and continental liberalism also are distinct, even from as early as by the late 18th century. It's very, very, very clear that, let's say, someone like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Jean Locke are very different thinkers, right? So, yes. But the biggest problem in defining liberalism now is that we don't really know what we're saying, except that no one really likes the word, and people on the left don't like to be called liberals. It actually meant a type of a moderate who simply maybe thought that the tax base was a good place to look to underwrite policies that states might take up in the area of infrastructure development or health and human services. You see what I'm saying? But that's not what it meant in the 19th century. But that's like from the Kennedy period. And then the term fell into disuse, and until the late 90s, when a guy named Frankel, who's a comedian, ran for office as well and got into office. Actually, was, I think, only recently kicked out. I forget his name, but he actually basically kind of made the thing like, I'm proud to be a liberal and stuff like that. And that kind of opened up this whole thing of that. But by and large, the very few Democrats who actually, in the left-wing sense of liberal, maybe in the kind of Roosevelt or Kennedy on steroids type of sense, they don't think that that's possible through the brand of liberalism. They think you kind of almost have to say that we're for socialism just to land on things that you might call in the American sense liberal. You see what I mean? Gotcha. But it does in America. 19th century, 18th century liberalism refers to kind of like, from the point of view of people who have money that don't want to be told what to do with their money. You see what I mean? And but it also, because these people with money are not blue bloods, they're not lords, and there's no other really way in the system that they're coming out of to distinguish them from the rest of the people. And to get the rest of the people to support their gambit for power, right? The nouveau riche we're talking about of Europe 200-300 years ago, right? For this power gambit of the nouveau riche, right, who aren't blue bloods and don't have titles, okay, for them to have the right to do things means that everyone is going to need to have the right to do things. But fortunately, since the things that they want to get done actually require money, it doesn't matter that everyone has the right to build a mansion. You see what I mean? It doesn't, because only a few people can afford to anyway, right? So that's kind of like, but but because it required this progressive front or this pan-class alliance of the 18th century between like the urban poor, the craftsmen, the guildsmen, the peasantry, the small peasantry, the poor peasantry, the rich peasantry, like different classes in society kind of had to get behind these liberal revolutions in France and America, and these ideas that spread afterwards, right? So, but yeah,
Tell
you
us
can see that that's not
when
the.
you think the perversion started of the term liberal, as in like in modern days. Like when did liberal become a bad thing?
Yeah, it's not so much perversion as it is just how the term got
Transmutation.
used changed. Like it went out of use for like a long time. It you see, and because liberal could have meant national conservative, it could have meant liberal could infer many different things. Either you can be liberal in terms of open-mindedness and believing in a pluralistic society, but economically as a nation, you should be mercantile in your relations, not open market. So there's different ways to be. There's liberalism is a whole paradigm, and you're still living in it. The idea that you should say what you want and go where you want and live how you want are liberal ideas. So anyone, if it offends you that someone says you should live here and this is the only job that you should have and this is the part of the world you should live in and this is the God you should worship, okay, those are illiberal ideas. You see what I mean? So we shouldn't think that there's something like a big problem with. Are you with me? Am I making sense? So yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
like,
I'm with you.
but but then there are people in American politics, I mean, who believe things in America, let's say just voters, um, who favor voting for like more state subsidy for things or laws which, and not subsidies per se, but laws which prohibit, let's say, businesses from having as much power as they do. You see, those could be considered liberal as well today. So is that a perversion? Yes, because classical liberalism says almost like no restraint to business, right? And today liberalism in America, but see, the word liberal in Europe and how it's used, like a liberal democratic party in Europe today, it would be considered like a center-right party. It would be like, okay, yes, the rights in terms of the universal rights of man in the sense of the French Revolution that spread throughout Europe in a kind of deformed Republican way, right, through the French Empire of Napoleon, right?
Yep.
So the liberal reforms in Europe under the Napoleonic Empire, as you can see, an emperor is not a liberal unless you can say, well, this is an emperor who's kind of guaranteeing through a dictatorship these liberal reforms, right? You could make an analogy between Napoleon then and Stalin, or for
Mhm.
example, like this, because the idea of like a dictator or like a duce is kind of antithetical to Marxian conceptions of socialism prior to Stalin, you see. So it's a very, very interesting thing, but it gets used as an epithet that can serve to really divide people. And that's why I think it's, in the sense that it's corrupted, I actually would agree with you when it's used in the way that you've said as a diss, not because there shouldn't be words, but because the political language that is being used today is meant to keep us from understanding each other and of forming common cause around immediate issues that are affecting the broad numbers of people, but they can't seem to agree on the right outcomes because they're speaking incompatible languages. So, right.
what about the distinction between liberal and libertarian? Like, 'cause you mentioned the
I would say
U.S.
that,
and
yes, libertarian is a closer to the original meaning of let's say liberal, the word liberal in the European
mhm.
sense, somewhat too, really. And however, in the European sense, it's shifted hands. It's a ball that's been in several courts as well, because radical liberals in the 19th century of the popular liberalism, or like peasants liberalism or poor people liberalism, was kind of all anarchism. And so you have these things like libertarian socialism, libertarian communism, which are similar to anarcho-communism or something like that, anarcho-socialism or whatever, right? So it's a very interesting word. But one thing that I think that 1,000 years from now, like hypothetically, research historians from that point of view, they'll kind of see it more macrocosmically as all making sense as one historical period. You know what I mean? And you have these different themes about the main underlying thing that you can say is probably most consistent about liberalism, which it's the ideologies of modernity afterwards, which are also ideologies of modernity, fascism and Marxism, let's say, right? These political theories are all within the rubric of modernity. So is in trying to distinguish between, big uppercase L liberalism as a historical paradigm, which includes all these kind of center to extreme left and right iterations, which can all somehow use this word liberal or all kind of participate in some aspect of liberal ideas. You see what I'm saying? Because fascism in its different ways and Marxism in its different ways make references to important aspects about human dignity or the inherent rights of people, irrespective or without reference to, let's say, a supernatural or benevolent creator of some kind. So you can say that what marks the ideologies of modernity, including liberalism and big L liberalism and modernity, are almost interchangeable. And you can almost see how, in some ways, like the aspects of the extremes of these different left and right liberalisms actually kind of bleed in very, very seamlessly into, socialism and fascism and things like that, right? So you can see that all the ideologies of modernity, like from the point of view of 500 years in the future, looking back, it'll be more clear that this was like a single time period, and it'll seem less contradictory, from the outside looking in the future. But from being in it, all you're seeing is the different nuances and shades of the human experience, and then people trying to put kind of like words to these in a way which unfortunately can be manipulated, and I would say are being manipulated to keep people kind of at odds with each other, right? So, but yeah, libertarian is definitely more in some way. But the one issue, however, is that like original liberal ideas, were conceived kind of in the abstract, but without perhaps a strong prescience into as events would develop, or as, let's say, what the consequences of 200 years of a liberal system will do was not really thought about or hypothesized by liberal thinkers of the great, of the Enlightenment, basically, right? You can actually associate liberal ideas with the historical period in Europe called the Enlightenment. And that's all analogous. You can say the Enlightenment, you can say modernity or early modernity, and you can say, the uppercase L kind of liberal historical period or the modern historical period, right? And that aligns in terms of the concepts of the first, second, third, fourth industrial revolution, which was originally not a Schwabian concept, but has been now officially used by them. That goes back to the close of the 18th century, right? So the problem you see, working brother, is that some could argue that the outcomes of economies of scale, if as important to liberalism is the right to do with your property as an extension of yourself what you want, it is also an aversion to systems, whether they be of scale or some other way, which kind of have such a strong weight upon all the potential outcomes that they're equivalent in some way to coercion, that is kind of forcing people without, let's say, inherited, whether mental faculties or wealth from, titles and deeds and inheritances, right? There's some that whoever is the kind of disinherited of the earth, whatever argument you want to make about that, the outcomes for them are certainly illiberal.
Yeah.
And so is it just liberalism for the few and freedom for the few? And then they can, construct these 50, 100,000 employee factories and then people working 12, 16 hours a day. You see, are they free? You see what I mean? And so then maybe there's something also to liberalism in terms of how you manage societies with scale. So anyway, that just, I'm not taking a side. I'm just helping people understand how different people today can think that liberal should or could mean different things. The libertarians have a very strong case, but then this kind of Kennedy Great Society thing about checking corporate power, right? And checking, like, now that we have monopolies, well, actually libertarians would agree that monopolies are anti-market, anti-freedom, right? Yeah. But maybe libertarians maybe sometimes play some three-carded Monty when it comes to, are you talking about hypothetical capitalism or the actual capitalism that everyone's had for the past 200 fucking years? See what I mean? So there's that problem too. So yeah, same thing with the socialists, by the way. I mean, they do the same thing. Yeah. Well, there's never really been socialism or blah, 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 or whatever.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. So
socialism and communism always fail is the trope that's
right. And then the trope response is it's never been tried, really, right?
Yeah.
So when people say likewise capitalism always leads to monopoly and systems of oppression, the libertarian response is, well, it's never really been tried, you see, or that's not the system that we have, in fact, right? So it's all working against that, and those distinctions work against our understanding, don't they? So
to round it off, why don't you tell us about your take on what conspiracy theories are and what actual conspiracies are as opposed to actual theories? Because you're somebody who's dabbled in this kind of material for, I'd say, at least a decade, maybe more. Correct me, probably longer.
Well, yes, so sure, surely, yeah.
What's your take? What's your take on how conspiracy theories become conspiracies and then fact over the years?
Sure, right. Well, the Western intelligence agencies seem to have been operating at whatever time they came together in the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the forms that we have today. A mentality that large operations of scale should ethically or necessarily somehow be conducted against their own civilian population, which one could understand perhaps a security prerogative for, right, rationally speaking. But then when one looks at perhaps aspects of the undue influence on the corporate or certain type of self-serving vertices, I don't mean corporate like, oh, the problem is that it's private or something like that. I mean structurally a powerful vertical as one of the, as a major stakeholder in society, right? I mean, the military-industrial complex is much more involved in terms of the complexity of different industries than simply the industries that produce what you would call arms, right? So in a sense, the truth is that the American system, when you look at the subsidy of the military-industrial complex, has been in fact operating as a socio-spatio-corporatio, whatever system, but it's definitely a top-down subsidy for connected people, and it's definitely like a highly competitive Darwinian social experiment work mill for average people. But for the Elon Musks and that kind of stuff, that attitude of entitlement is something that their entitled parents imbued in them, but it's not the reason that they get ahead. That's, by the way, it's actually just a consequence of actually being entitled. So, and they were handed the keys to these things to run them and stuff. So one would have to ask if that is more like a liberal system or more like a monarchical system in the negative sense, right? Very, very good questions, though.
I'm glad
But
you had the
conspiracy,
time to
yeah, but
spend.
conspiracy theories, yeah, but conspiracy theories, I
Go
understand.
on.
It's
Yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
yeah, it's like because of this undermine of faith, then and without and with respect to the decline of journalism, bear in mind that in the waning years of journalism in the 80s and 90s in the West, um, they continued. They continued. They were exposing things. There was some real journalism happening almost until the very end. Many of the things that they were talking about, which should pass Snopes fact check muster, in fact, were confirmed by mainstream media decades ago as plausible things, as real things that we should be allowed to talk about or hypothesize about, right? If taking the American norm that things that they talk about on the news are the things that we're allowed to talk about in polite society, right?
But we're
So,
not actually talking about these things. This is just like a comedy show. Nothing here. It all
yeah, right,
resembles
yeah,
anything that
right,
resembles reality is coincidental.
just a comedy show. So I think it's like,
Very
yeah,
bad
they have
comedy.
a very bad comedy show, and they have like they're creating a kind of therefore distrust in the population based on how they conducted these schemes of mass scale intelligence schemes, of mass scale on the public. It came out with the Church Commission, and what was that, 75 or 76? Forgive the error there, but it was already said that the CIA is writing the articles for the New York Times and stuff like that. And people also saw, like, learn from Freedom of Information Act, which is great that it exists and is something that needs to be expanded for sure, is
Yeah.
like how the FBI infiltrated the Black Panther Party and got them to fight each other by writing fake letters and impersonating different members and causing shit between them.
Just like
And
bots on Telegram.
right, just how Telegram works. So it's and that's called COINTELPRO. So the
Yeah.
thing is how short-sighted, unless having people be disgusted by that is part of the strategy, okay, which is a question. But it's so otherwise so short-sighted, and the amount of public backlash. So without credible journalists, without credible researchers, without and with intelligence organizations which have admitted in front of Congress have conducted operations against the public or using the public or whatever how you want to phrase that, that this is where the damage was done. So then if the powers that be, who have zero credibility, say something, whether it's true or not, people just kind of assume that something else must be true, other than what the government is saying or the
What
media,
was
the
it that
corporate
Bush
media.
said?
Right? What's
Fool me
that?
once. What was it that Bush said? Fool
Yeah,
me
yeah.
once.
Yeah,
Shame on
Bush
you.
said,
Fool me.
yeah,
Shame on.
fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, you can't get fooled again.
Yeah,
Why?
that's
Because it's
exactly.
meaningless. There's no way the expression could possibly say shame on me. Like, that doesn't make any sense. I'm a Bush.
Yeah. Yeah.
You mean shame on
All
you?
right.
If you fool me once, shame on you. If you fool me twice, shame on you twice, right? That's how it should be. Yeah.
I've got a list. I've got a list of like 15 other topics, and I'm sure you've got the gusto to like cover them all. But I think after this 1 hour we've been privileged to spend with Joaquin, we should stop recording and
All right.
maybe start another one. Joaquin, new resistance on Telegram. You've been erased from the internet everywhere else. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes, effectively, no. I mean, I'm not going to talk about where I'm not erased, but yeah, I'll make my fucking moves. I got my plans.
All right, excellent. So, Joaquin, thank you for stopping by. It's been an
Yeah.
excellent talk. We covered all kinds of topics.
All right.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, everyone. And we're going to take it out with some music. Thank you.
Bye.
you hang up?